Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast and welcome to my co-host today, which is not Ben. It is in fact Simon Kuestenmacher. How are you, mate?
I'm very good. Very happy to sit in for Ben this week.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to have you because your episode previously was very, very popular. And I think for two reasons. One, because you're very good at what you do. And two, I think you've got this amazing German accent that I think Australians find fascinating. So I think we'll spend a bit of time unpacking that. But yeah, you've come across as one of my co-hosts or guests, and I'm super excited. But just in case anyone who's listening to this is not quite sure who you are, Simon, which I don't think there'd be too many, but you are the co-founder of the Demographics Group based in Melbourne. You're a columnist with the Australian newspaper and the New Daily newspapers, and you're an engaging speaker who backs your opinion with data and evidence. So you are very well versed in all things demographics, which is really, really exciting. But mate, I'm really pumped about having a conversation with you today. But I'm super keen to for our audience to get to know you a little bit more. And I just want to know, when you were growing up over the dinner table, can you tell me what conversations were like with your family around money?
Well, money was somewhat spoken about, so it was definitely not a taboo problem. So both of my parents were authors. So that means that income was very much unpredictable. And that's back in Germany. And so taxation always depends on the previous year's income. So if you had a good year, it means that the tax for the next year, which probably was not so good, really put you into cash flow problems for a couple of months, which was a nightmare. And so there was never really that big of a joy over a good year, because you knew it actually made the first couple of months of the next financial year a bit tricky. And so that was always somewhat openly spoken about. I understood that money wasn't too much of a taboo. But I also, at some stage when my parents had a third kid, unexpectedly, if you will, later in life, we moved into a bigger house, and that was potentially a stretch financially. So it actually was a very difficult and probably not a wise decision to have made. And even during that time where money was difficult, or financial situation was difficult, my dad always was very generous with money, meaning he always tipped very generously when he gave money to people. And he said it's important because he believes there's a certain karma built into money. It's like you have to be generous in order to receive generously. It's a bit maybe woo-woo esoteric in its message, but I honestly believe this, that my dad then just happened to write what happened to be a really big bestseller at the time, and then things worked out just fine for us and this house financially. So a big gamble doesn't always need to be ending with big calamities.
Do you subscribe to that then, the karma? Because I believe that there's energy in money as well, and if you have negative energy around it or positive, but
totally.
Is that some of the guiding principles that you have with managing your own money?
Absolutely. You need to be extremely generous when you deal with money, when you hand out money, when you hand out your time as well. So it's not just generosity in financial terms, but also generously help out people with your time whenever you see somebody might actually need you to help them with your time, with your money, with whatever nice gestures. It does come back. I'm not religious in any specific sense, but I do think that this comes around in one way or another, and it does only benefit you in the long run.
I think there's an important lesson here from you, is that you've seen a positive message from your dad, which is fabulous, right? So, but I think for everyone listening to this, it's a timely reminder that whatever behaviors you are displaying, your kids are going to pick this up, And quite often they will take that into their adult life. And if it's negative, they're going to have to do some work to undo it. But if it's positive in your case, you can see that that's had some flow on benefits. And then I'm sure your kids will see that across your dinner table.
Absolutely. So we got a 1.5-year-old at home. And once you really understand that, all the research about child rearing says kids very carefully look at what their parents do. So whatever you tell your kids isn't half as important as the stuff that you do. So if you believe that, and if you want to act accordingly, it means that by default, poor parents have to become better humans to actually guide the kids down the right path. So it is this whole idea of constantly being, this person to look up to act this way, not to be talking behind people's back, and not to send out weird or difficult messages around money, for example, that could then stick with a kid forever. And there's so many unquestioned biases that you carry around with you that you caught from your parents at an early stage, and you don't examine them. Not all of them require you to go to a psychoanalyst to unpack them over many decades of work, but it's worth to actually understand where certain beliefs come from that you might have. It's better to live in a house than to live in an apartment. That might be true for you. You might really believe it. It might actually be true for your family, but where the hell does this belief come from?
Yeah.
And it's this idea of constantly questioning your own beliefs and going like, do I actually think this? Is this actually what I believe? And you might well believe it, but you might not.
It's a really good point too, because if you're taking on beliefs from previous generations in Australia, growing up in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, that was just the norm. But like, my dad talks about flats as if they're toxic, dump sites, right? Because he's born in 1939, the idea of not living in a house is just that mind blowing to him. It's crazy. Whereas, as we move closer to bigger cities in Melbourne and Sydney, having that same belief locked in your mind without actually examining why and where it's come from might not serve you, because clearly to buy a house, you're going to be up for a fortune. You're going to move a long way out. Yeah. I'm certainly interested in what you said before about your parents being authors and they couldn't celebrate a good year because that meant that the tax department thought that was going to happen every year, and they upped their tax as self-employed people, I'm assuming. How did that play out for you as you start to move through teenage life, get into your 20s, starting to get your first job? I know you went to uni, but as you start to develop getting your own independence around finances, was there anything in that came up for you, or were you getting consistent income and it wasn't?
I think how that played out is, first when you work at a supermarket, while you still live at home and stuff, it doesn't really matter. This money was just went straight to the pub afterwards anyway. So it really didn't matter what this was for. But then after uni, I did have stable employee style jobs for quite a while, and only now am involved, in running a business, in really being impacted by the flows of income. You can somewhat predictably manage certain gigs that you have on a regular basis, like writing, but consulting work, for example, comes in ebbs and flows, but somewhat steadily. And then all of a sudden we realized that the general ebbs and flows of the speaking market, so I'm a public speaker for the biggest share of my life, if you will, usually had 2 months off over December and January, because in December you compete with Christmas parties, and they want a rock musician rather than a demographer at most Christmas parties. And then January, Australia is still in hibernation, if you will. But so you had 10 months of pretty predictable speaking income. We run a good business, we're in high demand, so that works well. But now COVID, of course, completely threw this out of the window, this predictability. And that's very difficult, because you do need to then deal with the uncertainties of life, with lockdowns, and with how do you manage a family. And on top of this, how do you manage an income, and how do you manage the lulls of incomes? And I think there is where my parents' education, if you will, really came in handy, because I'm extremely conservative with money. Money for me means nothing but security. Having a lot of money put aside means I can live without income for X many years. That's really what money means for me. I sometimes play the 10X game, which means what would I do? How would I change my life if I had 10 times the income for exactly the same work. I don't get more holidays. I have to do exactly the same hours. How would I change my life if I had 10 times the income? You come up with little things where like, would I buy a bigger car, better computer, or whatever, all of those things. But it wouldn't change my days. The utility is still the same. So you buy a better bed, still sleep my 6-7 hours, and that's it. So there's not much that I would change with more money. I live a very comfortable life. Money is a weird thing because the more you have of it, the better. More money is better than less money, no matter the way you look at it. But also more money, in a sense, doesn't matter so much as you might think. It is, for me, just security, stability, and then I just live a somewhat humble and predictable life in my habits and work.
I think there's another lesson in that you've actually analysed what's important. You haven't just chased this ongoing merry-go-round of getting more and more and more without actually realising that more and more doesn't actually give me more of what I want. And I think that you're a rare breed for someone who has actually done that introspection and thought, well, I don't actually need more. And your parents have set you up well because you deal with the lack of security of income by building a war chest so that you can ride through that insecurity of income. So I think there's some really good takeaways from there. And I think the other takeaway is that you're destined to be an author, because if your parents are authors and you're in the game that you're in, so it just seems like multiple books is probably in your future. Is that the pathway?
Well, I got one or two map books already out there now, just little cute summaries of maps. There's a new, I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to say this, there's another book in the works about maps.
Little exclusive, I like it.
And then there are a couple of book projects in the long term that are very much
on the cards. All right, well, you'll have to swing past the couch and let us know when they come to fruition. Hey, so that's a good opportunity for us to get a little bit to know you and your money personality, and I think that's been highly helpful for our audience to get to know you. But we usually kick off an episode with a mindset minute theme, Simon. I've asked you to let me know what that might look like for you. So let's kick it off. What is your mindset minute theme today?
So the little mantra, if you will, that I live by is that I very much believe in the concept of minimal happiness. And minimal happiness for me doesn't mean that I am not miserable. It means actually it is the lowest level of happiness that you can achieve. And for me, that is linked to exercising. It's just as simple, if there isn't a lockdown, as going to the gym at night. I'm doing my workout. I'm listening to an audiobook at the same time, body and mind kind of thing. And that's good. That gives you stability. Go like, okay, whatever crap happened beforehand during the day, that's good. So you move into the right way. You build a healthy body, a healthy mind, an educated mind. And that's good. That means you're moving into the right direction no matter what. And I guess that's part of what I mentioned about my parents being authors. So the idea of reading has been instilled as a value. And now I have a little toddler at home. It's become a bit more difficult to do the whole one book per week rule that I live by for the last 20 years or thereabouts. And so it's now a book per fortnight. You gotta adjust. And audiobooks help for that. And it's really a way of achieving this. Another hack that we have is we don't even own a TV, for example, because I'm in front of screens 10, 12 hours a day anyways. So I might as well pick up one of them books in my little spare time.
I like it. What the listeners can't get a sense of right now is I'm looking at you on a Zoom screen, and behind your left shoulder, there is an enormous amount of books on your bookshelf. So there's no surprise to me that you're a reader. And Audible's great. I'm with you. I put a book on whilst I go for a ride, and I kill two birds with one stone. But can we just press in a little bit more on the minimal happiness? So where did you get that concept, and is exercise the catalyst to get you to minimal happiness?
For me, it is. And so if you look at all this research into how the body works, it does actually create lots of endorphins, and it really helps. This is why there are all of those programs where you try to get people out of deep depression. There's always an element of just moving, because it actually works you to feel a bit better, to feel in your body, to feel to be in the present, to be outside of your head, to actually live in the world that is. Because lots of the anxiety is not linked to the here and now, but it is linked to the past and to the future. And so to experience the here and now a tiny bit occasionally is helping a lot. You can do this with guided meditation or just any kind of contemplative prayer. All of these things are very much possible. It's all proven to work. But for me, the catalyst or the tool is exercise.
I love outside of your head. That's amazing. If someone wants to come to me for advice and they're a bit worked up about something, so yep, I'm happy to give you my time. But what I need you to do is I need you to go for a walk for an hour. And then once you've come back from a walk for that hour, then I'm happy to chat you through it, because the perspective changes. And what you just said then about getting outside of your head, you find that conversation you have with that person is so much more meaningful, and you can get progress rather than just, you don't have to hit your thumb twice to realize it, don't have to hit your thumb twice with the hammer to realize it hurt the first time, right? So as long as you can get outside of your head, that's really amazing. So I like that. That's really, really good. So thanks for sharing that. Today, we want to talk into, in your wheelhouse, get into your lane around demographics and numbers. If anyone wants to listen to your episode that we did back on episode 314, it was a phenomenal podcast episode. I reckon that you should dial in and listen to that as well. So we got a little bit about your professional background, how you came into the numbers, and why demographics now can actually be sexy, because you can interpret numbers and actually make it have some meaning. I mean, we had you speak with our team at our conference at the beginning of the year, and I surveyed the back of the room, and I was watching everyone. You had them hanging on every word, and I'm thinking, wow, that's amazing that you can get someone who can captivate an audience, a large audience, by just talking about numbers that appear in whatever research you can get, and then you get to interpret that, because people love to see how that impacts them. So I'm excited about today, but we can't go past this conversation without talking about Census Night a couple of weeks ago. What does that mean for a demographer? Is that like AFL Grand Final day for you? It's like it's finally come 5 years later.
Absolutely. Every year or every 5 years, I make the same mistake. I get very excited about Census Night. And then I realized you actually have to wait almost a year to get the actual data, to get the actual outcome from the census. So it's always the same disappointment that I have. And usually,
why is that? If we've got data that's now being collected electronically, we won't talk about 2016, which was the failed census night where the system crashed. But I did on my iPad, I filled it in, didn't take long. They've got the data. Why is it taking so long for them to release it?
Simply because the census that we are creating is insane in its scale. If you look at the Americans, they run a census every 10 years and they ask 9 questions of the population. We run a census every 5 years and we ask 65 questions of the population. The ways in which you can cross-tabulate our data is endless. It is massive. And the data isn't just fed into the ABS system and then made publicly available to everyone. There are lots of privacy protections that you need to build into the data, that you cannot go, if in your suburb, your neighbor is the only, Greek fella or whatever, you can just go, Greek fella, my suburb, and I'll just look up all their personal details or something like this. So you have all those layers of protection depending on how you pull the data out. An individual layer of data protection is out there so that you never ever, as an end user, use the raw ABS data. You only use tables that you ask the program to spit out, which is why the ABS program is called Table Builder. You build your own kind of tables. You never ever get to touch the raw data itself. And it's a wonderful, wonderful way for people like me to make a living in Australia based on this data. It is much easier and much more precise to analyze the Australian people and then to tell stories about the Australian people than it would be in Germany. In Germany, we don't run a census anymore, which of course has to do with census data being horribly misused during the Second World War. To find certain people, made it easier. And so therefore we run everything on surveys, which are not as precise, which are not run not asking that many questions that are linked to each other. So you run, if you run a census as several surveys, those surveys aren't connected to one another. So you can't do all this beautiful cross tabulation that we can do here. So the insights that we can get out of the census are insanely delicious for folks like me. And really, I write 6 columns per month. So I need a lot of material. And the next, once census data is released, there's a period of maybe 2 years or thereabouts where columns just write themselves. There's no shortage of topics, but then after a while, you need to steer away from census because it becomes a bit outdated. And of course, this census this time around is specifically interesting because we looked at different Australian cities at different stages of lockdown. So we do understand the differences between Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, which were different stages of lockdown at that time. We can't just say these are just differences of the locality. This is also the stages of lockdown. So the future data analysis becomes a bit more COVID flavored, if you will, and a bit more complex.
Because you did touch on that question there, because the closer you are as a demographer to the source of the data would be more exciting, right? So you're currently using 2016's data, which is 5 years old. Yeah. But as the echo of the 2021, you hinted then you get excited in the first 2 years. Does the year 3 to 5, is it generalized, or is there still rich information that you can get from that, even though that you're getting further and further away from the event?
So you then always need to supplement your research with other data sets. So if we do, and again, that's what I do in my consulting work, if somebody comes to us and says, well, you know what, we want to build 200 apartments in this corner of Sydney. Is that a dumb idea? We can say, well, let's look at the demographics. That's the one corner where we don't happen to have any apartments, and we can look at all these census data and say, well, but that's a bit outdated if we do this job today. So what kind of data do we need to implement? More recent population movements, generalized trends on top of this. And so the further you move away from the census here, the more complex the mix of data that you use to analyze something really gets. If I was a business that needs to make certain strategic decisions in the long run, if I look at it from a 10-year perspective, it doesn't matter that much how much out to date this is, because with demographics, we're always looking at big picture movements. And the demographic perspective, if you run a conference or if you write a big generalized report on a topic, the demographic piece would always be at the beginning of the conference, of the day, of the big report or book, because it sets the scene. I'm always the opening keynote at a conference. I'm very rarely the closing keynote of a conference, if that makes sense from my job. Yeah. And so based on this, that's how we slowly transition into different data that we look at based on how far away from the census we are.
2 final questions for you around census before we move on. But the first one is, you hinted at it before using Germany as a reference point, but our census process and data, where do we rank internationally? Like, are we in the top 10? Are we in the middle? Are we at the end?
We're absolutely outrageously fantastic. It's just that simple. Like, you need to be a rich and not massive country to run a big complex census. Yeah. New Zealand, Canada, Singapore are running awesome censuses. And you do see that those are small areas that are rich. Those guys run great censuses. At a certain stage, like the US, they got 12, 13 times as many people living there. They can't run a complex census like we do, because you always need to understand how much can you ask from your population, and how easy is it to actually get everyone. And getting 350 million people in the US or whatever it is very, very hard. Whereas it is reasonably easy to capture 25 million people, specifically if you run this whole thing digitally. And we are now increasingly getting to a higher share of online forms for data collection, which makes sense. It's so much easier to fill this thing out online than it is on paper. And then the data is already in the system. So you kill quite a few steps in the middle.
Gotcha. And so the second part of that then is, why should someone listening to this who cares? Like, I'm not a demographer. Like, that's great for Simon because he can analyze the data and write great pieces and prepare great keynotes. But what about the everyday Australian? It actually helps make better decisions around where to spend money on infrastructure, for example. So there is a real core benefit to everyday Australians.
Absolutely. As you mentioned just then, it is the one basic tool or set of data that we place or base all of our public spending decisions on. Infrastructure, just social issues. You know, we had 2 new questions in the census that are clearly targeted at helping the population. You know, you were asked whether you are I think clinically diagnosed was the term, with depression or with any list of chronic illnesses. It's immense, the kind of benefit that we can get from that by understanding the population, the demographics of certain illnesses. We can help people way better than, but it also helps us to spot certain areas. So if we do understand that anxiety and depression is probably somewhat evenly distributed across the population, across Australia, and then there are certain gaps where their people are not depressed, are not anxious. Is that either the island of the blessed, or is it a simple case of undiagnosed cases are just waiting to be uncovered? There is an increased need for people to help out. And that's a huge benefit from a public and mental health perspective. The other question is about veteran status. It asks whether you are an active military member or a veteran. And we have no idea about veterans in our country. And cross-tabulating veterans and potentially mental health issues, that'd be incredibly interesting. My best bet, of course, would be that veterans have a higher rate of anxiety and depression, but that's just me taking a guess. That's not good enough. We want data for this. And that's what the census is for, is hard data about facts, which is why this is so useful for us to actually help Australians. The goal of the census is actually to help government to make decisions and to allow Australian businesses to do the best they can to operate more efficiently, effectively across the country.
There you go, folks. They obviously get a good, concise insight into why it's important that we do collect this data. And it's kind of nice to know that we rank very highly internationally in being able to look after the people of our country from that data. Hey, I want to pivot to the fried egg versus the scrambled egg. We had your business partner, Bernard Salt, talk about this previously, but I think what I'd like to press in with you is you quoted recently some happiness research talking about when we commute by car, and then it flows into the fried egg versus the scrambled egg. So I'd love to tease out some of your insights here.
Yeah, so the idea with the fried and scrambled egg is that traditionally the Australian city looks like a fried egg, where all the jobs are clustered in the egg yolk, in the CBD, in the central business district. That's where the best jobs are. And people hate commuting. So that's what we know from happiness research, is that the single thing that makes you most unhappy in your life is actually commuting in a car. It is because you sit in a machine that can go 200 kilometers per hour and you're doing 12. And it is this disconnect between what's possible and what you are experiencing in the moment that makes you mad. And so people are willing to pay a premium to move closer to the CBD, to shorten the traditional commute. That was pre-pandemic Australia. For many decades, there was urban planning ideas about decentralizing the CBD to build secondary employment hubs where people have also big fat job clusters. But nonetheless, the CBD remained the single most important corner or job cluster in the CBD, simply because the kind of jobs that we added to the Australian workforce, they benefited from clustering together. A banker wants to be next to an accountant, wants to be next to their client, next to the startup bubble universe there. And so the jobs really benefit from being in this beautiful ecosystem. Only problem is that the workers who were filling these jobs didn't like it. And so the richer workers can move reasonably close to the CBD, and the poorer you are, the further away you move from the CBD, and the longer your commute is, the more unhappy you are.
Well, I like what you said too with the fried egg too, is in either camp, you'll tend to be unhappy, because if you don't want to commute, you come in closer, but to do that, you get a bigger mortgage, which makes you unhappy. But if you don't want to have a bigger mortgage, you go further out, but you'll be unhappy. So damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. So this fried egg model benefits the employer, and it benefits the individual jobs or the job role, but it doesn't benefit the worker.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden we had this beautiful, massive, surprising natural experiment across Australia, where we threw COVID into the mix. And instead of having people work from the CBD, we threw everyone onto their couch, their kitchen table, their study, and we had them work remotely. At the last census, 2016, 4.4% of the Australian population worked from home. At the height of the pandemic, and well, probably right now even more, about 50% of the Australian workers worked from home, which is huge. It's such a big shift. And so all of a sudden, the CBD loses its importance. It is still the most important and biggest job cluster in any given city, but it is not remotely as important as it was beforehand. And, you know, I can just talk about this. I can philosophize about this because I'm not invested into those big CBD towers. Everybody who is invested in the CBD tower, or the mayors of Sally Cap in Melbourne or whatnot, if you try to run the CBD, the central city, you are very keen for people to come back to the CBD. Well, fair enough, makes sense. But what's the best way of reinventing Australia, of reinventing our cities? What does actually benefit everyone? And so if you want to, you know, set it up anew so that people want to go to the CBD, I think you want to look at the kind of jobs, the kind of tasks that people do in their job. So in pre-pandemic Australia, you quite often, if you walked through any given office, any given open plan office, you saw people sitting in front of their screens with their big fat noise cancelling earphones, headphones, doing quiet work, writing emails, programming, you know, creating a PowerPoint presentation. Why do they need to be in the office? That's silly. It's a big waste of their time. They're better off and happier if they can do this work from home, and then only go to the office when they need to interact with their co-workers, when the work that they do together is interpersonal, collaborative, creative in nature. Then people should go to the CBD. So ideally, you would take all your work tasks that are interpersonal and bunch them into 1, 2, 3 days, do those in the CBD office, do all your quiet thinking tasks, and do them at home for the remaining days of the week. That's a way better way for the workers. That would mean that we need to rethink what the CBD looks like. So any given CBD office would then be much louder, much noisier, because all the quiet workers are gone. They're sitting at home. And then a boss going through this raucous office would think it's mayhem maybe, but that's not. It's just the noisy part of work is happening in the CBD. So it would really be nice to go to the CBD for a bit of camaraderie. You know, you constantly jump out of the office to meet clients or colleagues from other offices in a coffee shop. So it would be a more outdoorsy, more coffee focused, more interpersonal kind of CBD. I think it's actually a really exciting CBD.
Yeah, it sounds like a great new world. But I love what this is your quote out of your blog. The yolk needs to reinvent itself. So clearly that's the case. If you don't shift and you don't move, you'll find yourself competing in a marketplace that's skilled workers are at a shortage. You're going to find yourself losing people because they're going to be chasing these environments, aren't they?
And that is the number one advice for workers that are being forced back into the office and they don't want to. It's like at the moment, it's especially for, you know, as the higher up you are the food chain, the easier it is for you to find a new job at a better pay, than at your old job. So it's actually an ideal time to look for new jobs if you're unhappy with the remote working arrangements of your job.
So therefore, Scrambled Egg is here to stay, Simon.
Yeah.
We're not asking for fried eggs anytime soon, are we? The distribution of people further out, allowing them to do all the things that you said. This is not a pandemic situation. You see it as being a future trend that won't be reversed.
Exactly. I think you're making a really great point here. Whenever we look at pandemic trends, we need to honestly ask ourselves, is this just a pandemic effect that will then go back to normal once COVID is over? Or is this a new behavior that we learned that we want to keep to a certain degree. And then you would expect that something, the trend of working from home grows and it will fall back. We won't have 50% of people working from home, but it will easily land at 10, 15% of workers working from home, which then really reshuffles the dynamics or the costs of certain office structures in the CBD. So this is, this thinking, these predictions about the future are very much what commercial property investors or owners are, of course, interested in. We see a couple of big picture companies in the US making really big moves. Dropbox, those cloud space storage dudes, they killed their offices. They have no offices anymore. They have spaces that they call studios. And these are deskless offices. You only have collaborative spaces. They consider themselves a virtual first company. Everybody works from home as default. But for all those collaborative tasks where it's helpful to brainstorm a bit, you go into the office. They have massive kitchens, massive co-working, collaborative little corners there. But the office is not the default anymore, and by design. And I don't think that Dropbox would be the only company that does this. I think overall the work culture will shift a bit more in this direction.
It's fascinating. You kind of think, when you're looking at some of the history of these bigger tech companies, you see the Googleplex and Microsoft, and they're providing these hubs where people were having a lot of fun. But it sounds like that those stories of uniqueness will no longer be the case going forward. That'll become the new norm.
And if we look at this from a more complex system, even a Googleplex, for example, is probably, or the Apple campus might still exist in those specific areas if the only places to live nearby are tiny and crappy housing, which is Silicon Valley is a nightmare to live in for most of the workers. So you have people on $250,000 income who live in shabby little dwellings. And so if I live in this kind of small apartment or whatever, then I'd want to spend as much time as possible at a nice, beautiful campus, that delivers childcare services and all the shebang, which is, of course, all designed for workers to spend more time there and to work more. But I don't think we have anything resembling this in Australia. So I do think the Australian trend really is towards more working from home, which of course has a direct impact on real estate, because that means now everybody who has a white collar job that can be done from home is looking for a Zoom room, a separate room with a door to keep the cats and the kids out of their meetings. So this changes the way that we think about housing. And we might even think more about, how does a kid's bedroom need to look like in terms of how can we create them a little remote working nook or something like this. These pandemic behaviors, whether they're useful or not, they'll stick with us. If you remember all of those Greek and Italian grandmothers that have a really, really well-stocked pantry as if they would run out of food next Monday, that is a behavior that's stuck. That's a learned behavior from early on in their lives. And it makes sense because you mistrust a certain security, a certain sense of security. And I think we as a COVID generation, we might still have certain behaviors that will still stick with us. Will we ever throw out all of those cloth face masks? I'm pretty sure until the day we die, we'll have some sort of crappy drawer in the house that is just full of masks. And the grandkids will go like, a granddad still has the mask. It's like, you wait and see.
Yeah,
you'll need them one day.
That's a good point. I must admit, I never ever thought I'd live in a world where the masks were the normal. So interesting observations. Hey, I want to press in on another observation that you've made. You said closing the border to international people was like deleting the Uber Eats app from your phone. Interesting. Unpack that one for me.
What I mean with this little metaphor is that Australia really grew its economy over the last couple of years by just putting jobs on the skilled migration list. So you wrote in there, I need aeronautical engineers. And then a couple of days later, they were delivered like magic, like food, like your burger when you order on Uber Eats on your doorstep. So it was very conveniently for Australia to manage the inflow of workers into Australia. So we could really well manage the flow of workers into Australia. Therefore, we could manage population growth in whatever rate we thought was useful. And so we could grow at a fast rate that created high GDP, that created a nice and high income for the treasurer to be throwing around. So that was well liked. But now we deleted the Uber Eats app of our phones, and we all of a sudden have to cook for ourselves. If we now need an aeronautical engineer in Australia over the next 2-3 years, where migration will be very low at best, what do we need to do? Well, we need to teach a young person to become an aeronautical engineer. And you do this by baking them into the in the university system. And the same with all of those trade jobs. And you quite quickly realize that if we look at the May data, because right now in August, we have, of course, higher unemployment with Sydney and Melbourne in lockdowns. But at the May data, when we didn't have major lockdowns, we had unemployment rates extremely low, so that we were nearing full employment, which means that's the rate of unemployment where it's extremely hard to fill a job. And that should, at least theoretically, lead to higher wages, but it also leads to just difficulties for businesses to grow. So we've seen many industries that said we'd happily produce a bit more staff, but we can't. And this is from dairy in the Great South Coast, where you can't find any dairy workers, to more highly complex IT tasks.
Oh, and we can relate to that too. But you had a way that you think that could be helped through the TAFE system. Can you explain that a bit more?
So the one thing how Australia is going to build itself out of the pandemic, the impacts of the pandemic, is by investing heavily into infrastructure. The federal budget did just that. They put an awful lot of money aside to be spent on infrastructure. All this infrastructure stuff is linking the regions better to the capital cities, so it will benefit regional Australia. It's a smart move. It's a good concept. The only problem here is that we have no workers to build all this stuff. If you talk to the big industry groups, they are absolutely puzzled how they could fill all those jobs. And those jobs that are needed to build roads and rails and all these kind of beautiful things, they need to go through the TAFE system. And what we therefore need is universal free TAFE. We need to cut away all of those hurdles that might stop people from attending a TAFE course. It's absolutely crucial that we create enough workers this way. And I'm hoping that we do this at scale and rather quickly.
Because that'll benefit everyone. We've got more skilled workers, and then they'll have more people earning more income, which will have more tax revenue, and then more infrastructure, and so it goes on. You had this graph when we saw you at the beginning of the year around education being critical in this country for income. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so it's a simple graph that says the more highly educated you are, the more money you make. That is the simple reality in a knowledge economy, where you pay people based on their intellectual capacity of doing work. It's not necessarily means that you work harder. It just means that you are more highly trained. And that's the way that we're moving to. And one of those trends that we're seeing here is that we have an increasing number of workers, or we're growing jobs that require a university level degree. Those jobs are well paid, reasonably well paid. But we're also creating lots of jobs that are poorly paid. This is all the gig economy jobs, those Deliveroo type jobs where you don't need any formal training. You just rock up and you do the job. Those jobs, they lead nowhere. They're good to if you need temporary income. If you're a student, they pay a couple of bills. That's excellent. But a career on a gig economy job is a nightmare, and it must be avoided at all costs from a societal perspective, because the only way to earn more money on a gig job is to work longer hours. Your experience doesn't matter. You're not getting paid better delivering food on a bicycle if you have 1 year or 20 years work experience. There's no difference. So there's no career ladder. There is no job security in the first place. So these are horrible jobs to have in the system for people to rely on to secure their families. And so we don't want that. So we're building ourselves into quite a problem. And the beautiful thing with the TAFE system is that it creates middle-class jobs. And the middle-class jobs are the kind of jobs that have been stagnating and even diminishing over the last decades. So it's really the big goal for Australia is to create middle-class jobs. And that requires us essentially to upskill all those workers that are destined for gig economy jobs, to nudge them into the TAFE system. And to do this, the TAFE system must be attractive and it must be very easily accessible. Make it free, make public transport to TAFE free, whatever. Take away every single hurdle that you can think of.
Really good strategy. I mean, is there an appetite for it? Is there resistance to it? I mean, at face value, I mean,
as far as so intellectually speaking, I don't tend to encounter an argument against this. All the big industry groups are extremely in favor of doing so. It's just the difficult thing is, how do you get people that are on low income jobs that absolutely desperately need that money right now? How do you tell them, how about you take a nice easy breather and you study for 2 years to do this thing, because in the long run it will benefit you? It's a hard ask, and to ask this you need to at the very least make it free, make it easy to attend at bizarre hours, which we know with remote learning you can do. Of course, if you want to learn how to weld or whatever, you don't do this via Zoom. You do this by going to the workshop. But you can deliver some of the stuff digitally. You can deliver all of it for free because it will pay in the long run. If you think about this from an even more long-term perspective, low-income workers pay around 10% of their income into the superannuation. So do high-income earners. The high-income earners will, through the superannuation system, easily pay for their own retirement. That's the goal of superannuation, is that everybody pays for their own retirement through super alone. None of the low-income workers will have enough money in their super to get them through retirement. It's absolutely ridiculous to ask this. So therefore, we're just going to subsidize their measly super with the pension system, which is expensive, which is ineffective. So how about we get low-income workers into middle-income jobs where we actually have the potential to create those jobs? That's the beauty of it. I can't just be sitting here and say we need to get middle-income jobs created if there's no demand for it. There is demand. It's really, we see a big shift towards infrastructure. We see a big appetite for localized manufacturing. So we see an upswing in manufacturing in Australia since COVID, which is really great as well. Since there was, supply chain sovereignty issues where we were a bit nervous about, can we produce all the goods in Australia if we really needed to? At the start of the pandemic, there was one company in all of Australia that could create medical grade face masks. One company. That's not enough. And there was only 1 or 2 workshops that pivoted quite quickly to produce ventilators. So we're now having all those programs, once again, all budgeted for. That's the beauty, to strengthen local manufacturing. We won't go back to a manufacturing economy, but we're talking about adding a couple of tens of thousands of jobs, which is really, really helpful, particularly because the people that will take those jobs, they will be sourced from lower income buckets, the gig economy style buckets, rather than big attorneys and IT professionals who give up their career to go into manufacturing. That won't be happening. We really lift people up with a system like this, which is exactly what you'd want to do.
Yeah, look, it sounds like a very sound strategy. The gig economy can work alongside it so that they can actually get paid to actually get through that. It's free, so it gives all the incentives you talked about. And as you say, there's going to be a cost at some point. So at the end of work life or at the beginning of work life. So why don't we move it forward and give if we go back to your minimal happiness, we can help people get to a level of minimal happiness earlier, which is good for everyone. It's good for the community and has benefits. So well done. Hey, I'd love to talk about the shifts, the retail shifts during COVID. And is it true that we've just become a nation that just drinks more alcohol?
That's exactly what I thought when I first looked at the Australian retail data. I had an excellent chuckle. This was in May 2020 when the first data was released about, it's a monthly retail data set that shows the shifts from February 2020, pre-pandemic, to March 2020, first month of pandemic. And usually those numbers month to month change by 0.something%. So it's small, boring numbers that you usually look at. And then I saw that the number of the money that we spent on liquor sales, liquor retail increased by 31%, which is a ratio absolutely unheard of. And I had a good chuckle thinking about, this is the most Australian thing we do. We just drink ourselves into a coma to get through this. But then quite quickly actually had to look further down the list to understand that we just stopped going to restaurants, to cafes, to pubs, to bars, where we usually purchase our alcohol. So the thing, and exactly, it actually fell by 31% as well, which is a beautiful, symmetrical image here. It just means that the sales channel for alcohol shifted. So we have not become, a bigger drinking nation. We just drink at home rather than at a pub. But it's the thing of, you cannot be fooled by data. You always need to, dive a bit deeper, think a bit more about the story behind those numbers to be seeing this. But so that was the initial retail shift. Where, of course, we saw lots of retail businesses suffer because so many shops were closed. But then once we look at the data, the latest data is for May 2021 at this stage. So, 14 months of COVID impact. And retail just went through the roof. Every single of the 19, 15 industries of retail sectors grew, which is crazy. And some of them grew massively. And it's, of course, it is linked to the fact that we can't do much else. All the big spending items like overseas holidays, weren't there. Car sales apparently went down, because if you can't go anywhere, why buy a thing that gets you somewhere? But
plus you can't get enough of them in the country either.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we saw was increasing all those sectors like homewares, like furniture, like white goods. We heavily invested into the family home. We fortified, we beautified the family home. It makes sense. If you sit at home all day long and then you look at this ugly old couch for a year and a half, eventually you'll fork off a couple of $1,000 to get a new one.
Enough, I've got to change it. It's driving me mad.
I hate you. I've had it. And that's what we are doing. And it's another example, or another way of data showing us how Australians are obsessed with lifestyle. And we are still a rich nation. We have still record high savings, even though we also have record household debt, which is crazy. But it points to this segregated nation where we have more and more winners and more losers, and nobody in the middle. So that's what the retail data tells us. And housing plays a big role. All the winners, of course, could invest into housing. And there was more money there to spend on housing. Well, first and foremost, you don't spend on the family holiday. Money was cheap at the same time. So this is why we saw the household boom, which is, if you look at the migration or population data for a city like Melbourne, where usually people move to Melbourne, you see this big internal migration surge of population into Melbourne. And now we have people, leaving Melbourne for overseas, migrants returning home, international students returning home, and people just leaving Melbourne for regional Victoria, and people just leaving Melbourne to go to wherever, their hometowns are. And this is the beautiful, a typical chart of a town where we have house prices fall quite dramatically. But in Melbourne, the opposite happened. House prices went up and up and up in a system where house prices should go down. It's terribly confusing when you look at it, unless you understand broad demographics and you understand that just by dumb luck, no doing on our part, we happen to have the millennial generation born 82 to 99, just happen to be at this stage in their life cycle during COVID, where you start a family, where you leave your inner city 1 or 2 bedroom dwelling behind and you move into a 3 or 4 bedroom house. And so the demand for these family-sized houses just went through the roof, but it would have gotten through the roof anyways. It was just supercharged because you also have the working from home movement at the same time, which allows people to look further out of the city. Otherwise, people would all have looked at the same corners of the city, but now more and more people consider regional Australia, which throws a complete new set of changes into how real estate operates, because all of a sudden you have a couple of people moving to regional Australia, which was very much unexpected.
I'm going to jump in at this point because we've got a question from one of our listeners that is a bit of a segue to where you're going to go. But I think I think there's a really good takeaway from what you just said there, because you made the point that people are moving out of the city to the region, so that shouldn't that leave a vacuum into the city where they're leaving. But then you talked about the perfect storm of life stage, where you had this millennial generation moving in, which filled the vacuum of that demand, which is really interesting. And for anyone who's a real student of property, as our podcast listeners are, they should really let that particular message of what you just described land, because it's really, really important to help understand why Melbourne didn't just collapse in prices. And it's also got a little bit to do with not enough stock with that demand. And then it just then it became this snowball running down the mountain, where they think, well, I'm not going to sell before I find a property. And then all of a sudden stock becomes scarcer and scarcer. But let's go and have a little listen to the question now. Let's cut to a question from Maggie, because she's got a question around the trend towards regional Australia.
Hi, thanks for bringing on some awesome guests for the August edition. This is a question for Simon. I'd be interested to know, based on recent trends with a move towards regional Australia and increase in prices across regional Australia, do you see this trend continuing, or is it just a kind of a kickback or a side effect of COVID?
Simon, is this regional thing here to stay, or is it just a COVID symptom?
I think so. I think that the big move towards the region is, of course, driven by COVID, simply because you can move to the regions for the first time. So there is a certain, first big wave. But one of those things that will remain is working from home. That's here to stay. So it opens up the regions, particularly the regional cities that are what I call in extreme commuting distance to the main job cluster. So you might not would have moved to a regional city that is a 2-hour drive from the CBD to do this every single day. But maybe if you are confident that you can do all your meetings that you need to do in 1 or 2 days per week, maybe you're willing to take on that commute, to then have cheaper and better housing and potentially a better lifestyle for your family in this regional city. So this trend is certainly here to stay, which is, of course, very important for regional investors, regional property developers, because one of the reasons why those prices in the regions went up so high, particularly rents first, is that if you have a city of 5,000 people and you only add another 200 unexpected people into the mix, the housing market goes nuts. There isn't that much free property that usually gets moved around in any given year. And so you just throw a couple of people into the city, maybe people that are returners, young families where one of the partners was used to grow up in this place. Maybe it is just remainers. Maybe it's young people that don't decide to leave their regional town to go to this big city because, you might as well do uni remotely. Maybe it is just resettlers, people who resettle from the big city to the small city and then work remotely. So all of those trends, to me, suggest that we will see higher numbers of people moving to regional towns that are in this commuting belt than before. But it also means that these price movements shouldn't be as extreme as they were recently, simply because sooner or later regional developers will catch on and will then add to the housing stock in this particular market.
You said a couple of key phrases there: commuting belt, the extreme commutable. I call it fringe commutable. Yeah. Is there what happens if you cross that threshold? I mean, if you think about Victoria, go to Warrnambool. It's an amazing spot, but it is still a significant commute to Melbourne.
Exactly.
So without wanting to spotlight, Warrnambool, but just using as an example.
So Warrnambool is a great example because it is, you don't commute from Warrnambool to Melbourne. Maybe some people do sometimes, but it's, and it's not that great, that well connected to Melbourne. So it's a bit of a hassle to get to Melbourne. So therefore, people that move to Warrnambool must have some sort of connection to Warrnambool, or they must have a job that is completely, entirely remotely done. Because Warrnambool, how many jobs will the local economy create out of thin air? They, probably not that many. Maybe there is a local manufacturing company that sets up shop, and then that creates the demand for 50, 60 jobs. that's good. And this would be a demand for new jobs. But mostly, if you want this natural job growth of a city outside of the commuting belt, it must come from within. Jobs don't magically appear. There is a number of jobs that just magically appear based on population growth. If I grow a city by 100 people, then there is a higher need for retail people. We are still talking about decimal jobs at this stage, not a full job. But population, of course, creates job needs. But the big game in regional Australia will be, if you look at Victoria, will be your Bendigos, your Ballarats, smaller towns, Bacchus Marsh, Dalesford, these kind of towns. They will, and they are already seeing lots of growth because they're obviously in commutable distance. But that said, regional Australia isn't all easy going because they still face all the standard regional issues. Am I moving to a regional location that guarantees me that my remote work can be done well? Meaning, do I have
internet?
Do I have decent internet? Also, am I sitting in super risky bushfire territory? That might not be too attractive for some workers. So all of those things play a role as well. So the standard regional risks are still existing. So that also creates, of course, certain potential for services that you could offer in regional Australia. If a city cider or city slicker moves to regional Australia, do they want to really look after their 2 acres of land or whatever they purchased?
Yeah, they watch television shows and think that they'd be quite happy to have acreage and mow the lawn and tend the garden. But the realities are that it's a full-time job.
Exactly, it's just more stuff that you need to do in your day. If you have spare time in your day and you really like to mow the lawn and look at bushfire prevention stuff that you need to do and all this, then that's fine. That's cool. But it's literally a change in lifestyle, not just a change in scenery.
We are covering some ground here today, Simon, I've got to tell you. But this next question is from Julia. She's got a question around the donut when it comes to real estate. It'll make more sense shortly, folks. Let's listen to the question from Julia.
Hi there, Simon. Hi there, Bryce. I'm thrilled that the topic of demography is up again. It was my favourite subject at uni and I loved it on your last visit to the property couch. B&B have described a donut in terms of housing in the city centre, meaning the centre of the donut is to be avoided for investment purposes. I was wondering, Simon, if that is true for all other capitals in the world, for example, London and Paris. I have bought a place in the heart of the city of Sydney that is certainly not doing much while international borders are closed. It has, however, been consistently rented, albeit for a reduced rent. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of buying in the CBD for residential investment purposes and what you think of the notion of the donut. Look forward to hearing your response. Bye for now.
Now, Simon, let's be clear, you don't give investment advice, but we'd be interested in your insights around the donut, if it exists and what it does for demand.
Yeah, so if this is a question, Australian cities, Canadian cities, American cities, all the new world cities work slightly different from historical European cities. If we look at the new world cities, we do always have a clear CBD, a clear job cluster, and that is at the city center. And then you ripple out from there. And in this model, a reason why lots of property folks advise against investing in the CBD is because in the CBD, you essentially can only buy off the plan residential dwellings. There are certain risks with that. You don't know exactly how to finance them, how to price them. It's a volatile.
And it's unlimited supply. You know, when you're 1 kilometre out, you've got limited supply. When you're in the CBD, they just build another one, and they just build another one, and they just build another one. So it's that unlimited supply, which is the challenge in the middle of the donut.
And so in the Australian city, which is why essentially there was this rule of thumb where you say, if the CBD is the center where everybody wants to go to, you move into the middle suburbs. You know, it depends on how you define the middle suburb, but it's somewhere between 5 and 25, 10 and 20, whatever people say, kilometers away from the CBD. So it's essentially the Goldilocks scene. It means you can purchase a house that is somewhat affordable and it is somewhat close to the CBD. And the further you go away, then one thing gets better and the other thing gets worse. So you find the Goldilocks zone there. So that is traditionally by far the safest investment zone there is. In European cities, that doesn't function like this, because usually you have a traditional town center that is many hundreds of years old. If you look at Paris, if you look at Munich, that is a town center that is unchanged. So it's traditionally pretty touristy. It looks wonderful. It is well kept up. But then you have offices pop up somewhere else outside of the CBD. So you sure have some sort of like prestigious small scale businesses that are in the traditional city center, but then you have the office tower, and usually we have towers in Europe that are nowhere near the Australian scales. In Munich, the big towers that we have would be 8 or 9 stories, and that's massive there, and they're controversial and they're hated by everyone. So therefore you have smaller office towers, and you have the job clusters aren't as pronounced as they are in Australian cities. That said, if we only look at Australian cities, the donut system works, and the inner city thing should be weakened over the next couple of years, where international students are largely gone, where skilled migrants are largely gone. And we do know traditionally that international students and migrants, when they first come to Australia, they don't know how the city works. They have exactly one address in their mind. That's either their university address or it's their office address. And so they then move reasonably close to that address. So therefore, everybody of the initial migrants that have been here only a couple of years, moves first to the city center. And I call them launchpad suburbs. And from these suburbs, after a couple of years, that you speak to your fellow students, to your co-workers, you read the paper, you look on realestate.com or whatever, and then you slowly change your housing behavior to match the housing behavior of everyone else. But only initial migrants have this very, very special migration pattern. So when you look at the inner city suburb like Carlton in Melbourne, and you say, they are all Chinese there. It's like, yeah, well, that's probably true, but they are all recent arrivals. The well-established population, Chinese population, for example, they then distribute much more evenly across the city of Melbourne.
Yeah, really good insights. And if anyone wants to go into Launchpad Suburbs in more detail, if they go to the Property Couch Instagram page, we've actually created a carousel that explains that very thing that you've talked about. So I want to encourage people.
Yeah, that was a marvelous animation or story you've done there.
We've got a great team here, Simon, but it was your insights that we've done that. So folks, go to the Property Couch Instagram to check that out. Next question is regarding the exodus north, typically to Queensland. This one's from Morella, and this is Morella's question now.
Hi, Simon. My name is Mirella. I have a question in regards to the exodus of population towards north, most likely Queensland. They have quite a few projects in the pipeline, possibly an Olympiad, far away in the distance. Do you think that is sustainable? It has been something similar, a shift of population towards Queensland and Western Australia due to the mining that eventually crashed during the time. How do you compare now these new opportunities for Queensland with the opportunities in the past when they opened mines and so on? I hope this is clear. If not, just come with the best insight you have in regards to this. Thank you so much.
So that's a good one there, Simon, because you've obviously got some confidence around regional, and lots of people are sort of moving north, particularly on the east coast, to chase not only the sun but less lockdowns in Queensland. So what do you think that's got some longevity in it? And do you think that is, how would you compare that? I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but how would you compare that to the mining boom and bust of Queensland and Western Australia compared to what we're having in COVID now?
So I don't think it is anywhere near the mining boom and bust, because the people moving to Western Australia that are now not in Western Australia anymore, they are people who moved there for the mining boom, and they will leave as soon as the mining jobs disappear. The people that move to Queensland, they don't necessarily move there for a specific job. Lots of people move to Queensland still because it's the preferred retirement location. It's the Florida of Australia. So that thing won't go anywhere because we're continuing to age. And the old joke will continue to be true that, when you say, he died so young, he hadn't even moved to Queensland yet. So that old joke will still be true in the future. But why are people moving to Queensland at the moment? Well, we can look at internal population movements. And we do know that Victoria and New South Wales at the moment are bleeding population. People are leaving those two states within Australia. And they are moving to Queensland. Queensland is the big fat winner. We also have the NT as a winner, but not as big. The numbers aren't as big. It's quite dramatic how much Queensland grows in a country where actually we have no population growth at the moment. So that's interesting. And why is that? Well, arguably it is the lockdowns, but are people making a permanent life decision simply on the bet that this state won't have lockdowns and the other states will? Difficult to say. I do think it has much more to do with seeking the Queensland lifestyle. It has to do with beaches, with the cliche Australian lifestyle. If a foreigner thinks of Queensland, thinks of Australia, they are thinking of Queensland. And there is plenty of construction going on there. You find housing. Housing is cheaper. Do not forget that we have this big movement of millennials out of Melbourne and Sydney that are seeking affordable housing. Those millennials have, to a very high degree, jobs that are pretty mobile. If you work for a big employer, for a big bank, for a BHP, for whatever, they probably have offices in all of the three major cities at the very least. So why the hell wouldn't they go to Queensland, where housing is much cheaper? And particularly when we consider Queensland, you want to think about Brisbane not being a city in its own right, really. So Brisbane is part of Southeast Queensland for all intents and purposes, and the local mayors would hate me for this. Southeast Queensland, meaning Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Brisbane, is one coherent city. And it is one big fat city that has three major airports in it. So it is very, very accessible for travel within Australia. So it's lots of things are perfectly right in Queensland. And, with Brisbane taking the Summer Olympics, we would expect a particularly high level of construction activity there leading up to the Olympics. And so you would then so this is what happened with the Sydney Olympics. You then take the population growth, you almost take on credit the future population growth. So Sydney grew really fast leading up to the Olympics. And then there was a post-Olympic slowdown. And we'll see the same with Queensland, well, particularly with Brisbane. You'll see faster growth before the Olympics, and then it'll slow down a bit, the rate. But that just means you have plenty of construction opportunity there. People move there. The lifestyle benefits won't go away. So I wouldn't bet against Queensland, to be honest.
No, I agree. I've lived in Queensland on the Gold Coast for 4 years. I loved it. I love being down here in Torquay, but I certainly am jealous of the thing that they have up there, Simon. It's called the sun, and it shines brightly, and it's very, very warm. So yep, there you go. Hopefully that helps you there, Morella. I think it's fair to say that there is no direct comparison with the mining boom and the interest in moving up to Queensland. I've got a final one for you here, Simon. This one's from Dylan, talking about next suburb growth.
Hey, Bryce and Simon. When looking for the next growth suburb, what data do you look for to identify the start of a growth cycle, and where can you find this data? I currently subscribe to CoreLogic's property value, but it's limited data and I'm not sure what to look for. Cheers, Dylan.
There's a good one for you, Simon. I'm always thinking, I'd love to know the little nuances with data that you're actually unpacking, because for us, it's being on the ground, looking at things like entry-level European cars and bugaboo prams, and just sort of evidence of higher discretionary income, which would suggest they're probably going to go and, renovate and add some value to those areas. But I'd love to see if you've got any little nuances that you uncover in the data to help with that.
I like your approach an awful lot of, just being on the ground and taking those little hints, of looking at fancy prams, as you mentioned, the European cars, of just understanding, is there money? Is there more money in the suburb now than there was a little while ago? You can only do this if you invest somewhat locally. if you're somewhat familiar with an area over time. So it's an excellent approach for any kind of local real estate agent. That's crucial to understand this and to be really sharp in your observations. How I would pick suburbs, and of course I'm not doing this professionally, is looking at big picture data and then seeing whether my suburb fits this logic. What I mean by this is the biggest population trend over the next 10 years will be millennials seeking family-sized housing. So you want to then put yourself into the shoes of this millennial family. We do know from housing preference research that everybody, of course, wants a massive villa in a central suburb, 7 bedrooms, a pool for $500,000. But, there are very few of those around. So we all need to make compromises. Yeah. But the one thing that we're not willing to compromise on is the number of bedrooms. So therefore, I would look at, so those big millennial or those millennial families, they need 3 to 4 bedroom dwellings. Where can I find those? And what do those families care about? It's probably not immediately school zones, but if you buy a house at the moment, school zones will probably be factored in, because if your family, you're probably investing in the long haul here. So that kind of stuff is important. Always put yourselves into the shoes of the biggest buyer groups over the next couple of years. And then you need to think about, where does the housing stock come from? The housing stock of 3 and 4 bedroom houses, will they come from people that are selling their old houses, or will we need to build stuff for them? If we're just talking demographically speaking, the big cohort of downsizers, meaning elderly people that leave their family home or that sell their family home, that big trend is still a decade out. We do know that people usually, at least at a mass phenomenon, they don't downsize for financial reasons. They stay in the house until it becomes a physical hazard, until it becomes an absolute nightmare to manage this house. That means people usually don't downsize until their early 80s or thereabouts. And the big bulge of the baby boomer population over the next decade is still way too young to downsize based on these factors. Some baby boomers, of course, will downsize and will move to a more urban, sexy apartment or a tree change location or something like this. Sure, this will happen, but at a mass phenomenon, the big sales of the existing baby boomer homes will take place in the 2030s, not the 2020s. So therefore, I would always bet on, how do we add housing stock, relevant housing stock? Where are the 2-bedroom houses that can be transformed into a 2 or 4 bedroom dwelling? If we build new housing in this is my new topic, my new favorite obsession as a German in Australia, is why the hell do Australian homes in expensive suburbs don't have basements? If you look at cubic feet of property that you're buying, you could, add a third of mass to a house in a Northgate, in a Fitzroy, if it had a basement. It has, of course, to do with the way that we heat homes here and so on. But that's a big trend if house prices continue to grow. I would bet on houses having basements, just to change the physical setup of a house. We must react to those changes in circumstances.
Very good insights. I think there's some real gold in there, Dylan, in terms of what a demographer is actually looking for, and having because it's fair to say that you're looking at life cycles, and you're very much, you've quoted the millennials moving into that stage, but I've always thought baby boomers were like a basketball moving through a garden hose. So for a lot of companies, all they needed to be was in front of the basketball. When they were first born, it was a a pogo stick, because they were jumping on that. And then as they went through the life cycle, they then housing, and now it's all about lifestyle. And so but just that little trend alone meant that you could be ahead of where the demand was going. So I absolutely love the way that you forward thought what that looks like when people are in their 80s and when they're going to downsize. And I think there's some real gold in that for people that are listening to this if they want to apply that to property. All right, mate, we got to take a breath. We have covered some stuff. We have covered a lot of stuff. That was one of the exciting things I thought about having you on, Simon, is because you're a deep thinker. You really bring some amazing insights to not only numbers and demographics, but the way that you look at our property market and the unique ways that you look about Australia, given that Germany was your original location, and here you are on our wonderful island with all the opportunities that we have here. So thanks for all those insights. I'm going to call on you now for the life hack as we round out today. You've got one for me. What is it?
So my life hack today is just 5 simple truisms or standard rules, I think, that I look at when I'm considering what the future will look like. When I'm looking at data, when I'm considering what this might mean for the future. The first one is that every movement has a counter movement. What I mean by this, simple. We are now having a movement. Everybody needs to be vaccinated. Everybody wants to be vaccinated. Of course, there's going to be a strong anti-vax movement. It's true in almost, actually in every circumstance that I can think of, is there is a counter movement for any future trend. It's just anyone's guess how big this counter movement will be. The second one is the general rule of thumb that regulation follows innovation. If you think of Facebook, if you think of social media, they could go absolutely wild for a couple of years. There were no regulations whatsoever, but then after a couple of years, regulations will actually rein them in, and they come up with rules. We're seeing the same one at the moment with cryptocurrencies, for example. There was this crazy Wild West phase where cryptocurrencies could do anything, completely unregulated financial market. They're now being reined in and regulated. It will be true for any innovation ever into the future. The other one is a reminder for myself when I look at data: be aware of the what you see is all there is fallacy. That means that if you look at your circle of friends and everybody, does a certain thing, that you think that's all there is. No, always look at a broader set of data. Always widen your perspective way above your own point of view to understand what is actually going on. And therefore, you need to trust yourself that you can have your mind changed by data. And not just relying on your own observation, even though that remains to be important. And the other one is when you deal with people, particularly when I write columns that are very iffy about a certain topic, you always want to make sure that you allow your opponents or your readers or whoever you're dealing with, your audience, to leave the situation with a head held high. It's quite easy to go into some sort of evil debating mode where you try to, or cross-examination mode where you try to destroy the opponent. Nothing good comes from this in the real world. Particularly if it is around behavior change, you want to make sure that you provide an out for your person to leave the situation with their dignity intact, with a head held high. And the last one is always a question that I'm asking myself when doing analysis. Am I doing justice to the complexity of the situation? And if the answer is ever yes, you know that you're wrong. You're never, ever doing justice to the complexity of the situation. You are dealing with an incredibly complex, difficult to understand world out there. You will never fully understand it. You can only understand it as much as you can from your specific perspective. And the way that I do this professionally is that I always provide the demographic perspective on, for example, in the real estate sector here. I could show the demographic movements that are happening, but am I taking into account here interest rate changes, certain policy levers? Am I taking into account every single cultural preference that people might have for or against a certain type of housing? I don't, and I never can. I try to do as much as I can, but I will always fail to draw the complete picture. In cartography, we always say you must never confuse the map with the territory. The territory is always more complex than the map is. And I'm only ever creating maps, helping people to navigate the real world. And in this instance here, the Australian property sector.
Wow, there is a bit in that life hack. What I suggest people do is rewind and listen to that again, because I think there's some fundamental guiding principles there that not only for you to live a better life, but also for you to get a better perspective on what's going on. So, mate, very impressive. I like that. What's making property news today, Simon, is that our good friends at CoreLogic have recently suggested that the Australian property market is going to, this year, hit the $9 trillion mark. And they have an indice that they run, and using their August indices data, They believe that we'll hit 9 trillion later this year. But the current value they estimate to be 8.8 trillion. And what's important, I think, for those people that are interested in the Australian property market is they've estimated that the mortgage debt against that 8.8 trillion is 1.9 trillion. So if you do a loan to valuation ratio against that, that's 21.6%. So clearly, some people who've owned real estate for a long time will have a very low LVR, and some people who've owned real estate reasonably new will have a high LVR. But generally speaking, that helps to speak to the stability of our property market across the country, that in isolation, someone may be vulnerable holding some real estate, but as a system, the system of real estate is quite strong. So remarkable valuation. And just to put some context around that, Australian super, 3.1 trillion, Australian stock market, 2.8 trillion, and the commercial real estate market is 978 billion. So combined, all three of those, just under 7 trillion, right?
Yeah.
So, but the value of residential real estate is 8.8. So it's greater than all of those other asset classes combined, which I find fascinating. And it doesn't seem like that long ago we were reporting that the market was 7 trillion. Here we are now approaching 9 trillion. And to further reinforce the point here, Simon, you're a Melburnian as well. There was a house in Albert Park which was sold a couple of years ago for 2.97 million. You know Albert Park, it's the centre of the universe. It's arguably the greatest real estate in the world, given that Melbourne is one of the most livable cities in the world, and it's one of the best suburbs in Melbourne. 2.97. 2 years later, having done absolutely nothing to it, it's been sold for 3.67. So that makes a $700,000 windfall gain on that property in 2 years, having done nothing. So it kind of helps to get our heads around the fact why the value of the Australian real estate market is growing and why we're getting close to 9 trillion. Big number, isn't it?
Huge number. And I really like the fact how you described the systemic versus the individual aspects of the system, because you always want to look at the whole picture as well as what it could mean for certain individuals. And that's what we would look at when we want to say, well, is the market completely going to implode? Yeah, probably not. Yeah, some people will probably completely suffer. It's what we've seen in WA when people had very high mortgages for a house that fell in terribly in price. So that's of course what we want to avoid. But overall, the system is still stable, and that's good news.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you again for joining me today, co-hosting in Ben's absence today. Again, I look over your left shoulder and I see hundreds of books, and I think that me and the listeners have been the beneficiary of your well-read intellectual discussions around the topics that we talked about today. But mate, there was so much gold that you delivered, and on behalf of all the Property Couch team and the listeners, mate, thanks for co-hosting with me today.
Oh, that was great fun to be with you again, and loved the listener questions. You got a good cohort of people listening, it appears.
We've got an amazing community, mate, and I love it when they get involved too. But this is the point where we throw to Ben, who's not here, mate, so I'm going to do it this week for the last week because Ben is back next week. But knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it. See you next week with Ben, folks. Hey there folks, Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listen to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now, for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarizes the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D, and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.